Hello and welcome to STEM with Mr. N, where I perform different demonstrations and explain the science behind what we're seeing. This week I'm going to use a chemical reaction to make bouncy eggs. Let's check it out. We all know that eggs have a hard shell. This shell is made of calcium carbonate and its purpose is to protect the insides of the egg from physical harm, as well as to protect them from contamination from microorganisms such as bacteria, viruses and fungi. However, we also all know what will happen to an egg if you drop it onto a hard surface. In this experiment, I'm going to use a chemical reaction to make eggs bouncy. For this, you will need a glass or a jar, a raw egg and some white vinegar. Now, depending on where you read about this experiment, it says it can take anywhere from 1 to 3 days. So what I've decided to do is set up 3 different jars of this experiment. One of these jars I'm going to leave for 1 day, one I will leave for 2 days and one I will leave for 3 days. And then I will be able to compare which length of time produces the best bouncy egg. First, what I'm going to do is put one raw egg very carefully into each of my 3 jars, making sure not to break it on its way in. I found that tilting the jar on its side and letting the egg gently slide down the inside of the jar was the best way for me to get the eggs in, because I couldn't fit my hand into the jar while holding the egg. Next, I'm going to fill up each jar with white vinegar until the egg is completely covered in the vinegar. Then, to make sure my house isn't going to smell of vinegar and eggs for the next few days, I'm going to tightly screw the lids onto each of these 3 jars. And then I'm going to label each jar so I know how long I'm going to leave each one. The orange labelled jar I'm going to leave for 1 day, the yellow labelled jar I'm going to leave for 2 days, and the green labelled jar I'm going to leave for 3 days. You'll notice that very quickly after the vinegar has been added to the jars that bubbles are starting to form around my eggshell. A gas being given off is a sign of a chemical reaction, so this shows me that the chemical reaction for this experiment has already started working. Now that my experiment is set up, I'm going to put these jars away in a cupboard so they can't be tampered with by my son. I'm going to check on the orange labelled one after 1 day, the yellow labelled one after 2 days and the green labelled one after 3 days to see which length of time will produce the best bouncy egg. That's been 24 hours, so now it's time to check in on the 1 day egg. I'm going to open up the cupboard and take out the 1 day jar and take this over to the sink. I'm going to carefully pour the contents into a sieve so that the egg has a gentle landing. I'm then going to rinse the egg under warm water and gently rub the outside of it with my thumbs to try and clear off the remnants of the shell. You'll notice there are pink parts of shell coming away, but there's still a sort of white membrane there, and this feels quite tough, so I'm not going to keep rubbing at it because I don't want to risk bursting my egg, even though it does have a weird sort of bouncy ball feeling to it. Now that the 1 day egg has been cleaned off, it's time to do some drop tests. I'm using the exact same black tray that I dropped the raw egg into earlier on in the video, and if you remember back, I dropped that egg from quite a low height and it's still cracked. So I'm going to start by dropping the day 1 egg from a low height and then get higher and higher until I find its breaking point. Because although it does feel like a bouncy ball, it is also still fragile and it will have a height that if it's dropped from it, it will still burst inside this tray. This egg is actually surprisingly sturdy. I did not expect it to be able to bounce from such heights, and it's actually bouncing. Well, there we go. I've just found the point when it explodes. Up until then, it had actually been bouncing out of the tray and rolling around the table. I think I'd maybe just bounced it a bit much by that point, leading to that explosion while I was trying to say how well the egg had actually been bouncing. Now it's time to test the day 2 egg. So I'm going to open up the cupboard and take out the jar with the day 2 egg in it. And just like with the day 1 egg, I'm going to carefully pour the contents into a sieve so the vinegar runs away, but the egg drops gently into the sieve. Then I'm going to carefully run the egg under warm water, just like with the day 1 egg, and give it a rub to clear off the remnants of the shell and that white membrane that's just inside the shell. Like the day 1 egg, this egg also feels a bit like a bouncy ball while I'm washing it off, only the day 2 egg feels firmer than the day 1 egg. Now that I've cleared off most of that shell and the membrane, you'll see that the egg is translucent, can actually see inside and see the yolk moving around inside it. Now that I've cleared off most of the shell and that membrane, I've carefully moved the egg over to my testing area so I can test it in the same black tray that I tested the day 1 egg in, and also that I dropped the raw egg in earlier in this video. Just like with the day 1 egg, I'm going to start off by dropping this egg from a small height and then move higher and higher so I can see how high I can bounce the egg from before it reaches its breaking point. Now it's time to check in on the day 3 egg. So like with days 1 and 2, I'm going to open the cupboard and take the jar out. I'm going to carefully pour the contents of the jar into a sieve so the egg gets caught gently. And then I'm going to rinse the egg under warm water. The day 3 egg feels sturdier than the day 2 egg, which already felt sturdier than the day 1 egg. Also, it is quite a bit bigger than when it started, and it's bigger than the eggs from days 1 and 2. I'll explain why this is later on in the video. Now that my egg has been rinsed off, it's time to do the test to see how high I can drop the egg from before it breaks. Just like with the eggs from day 1 and day 2, I'm going to start off low and then get higher and higher until the egg bursts inside the tray. And again, I'm using the exact same tray that I used for days 1 and 2 eggs so that it is a fair comparison. Now that all 3 eggs have been tested, it's time to compare the results and explain the science behind what was happening in this experiment. I think the results are pretty clear. The day 1 egg was the bounciest. It could be dropped from the greatest height, and it was surviving the most bounces in the tray, and was also bouncing out of the tray and rolling around the table. I didn't think the day 1 egg felt as sturdy as the day 2 or day 3 eggs. Part of this might be because it was smaller when it came out of the jar, and I'll explain why in a minute. And also it was the first time I'd held an egg like this, so I was very wary and cautious with the egg and what I was doing. It didn't get the full shell cleared off for that reason, because some of that white bit that was still on the egg felt quite rough, and I didn't want to rub too hard and risk puncturing the egg. To get the best translucent egg, you really want to leave it for 3 days. As we noticed, the day 3 egg was much easier to clean off, and you could already see right into it before I'd started rinsing it under the warm water. It doesn't bounce quite as well as the day 1 egg, but it's certainly easy to be able to see inside the egg. It's also much bigger than the day 2 egg and the day 1 egg. So what is the science behind what was happening in this experiment? Well, vinegar contains acetic acid, and this acetic acid was reacting with the calcium carbonate that makes up the eggshell. As this reaction takes place, carbon dioxide is given off, and this is just like when you mix vinegar with baking powder that you get that carbon dioxide leading to the foaming. In this case, you see the carbon dioxide bubbles forming around the shell as the shell gets broken down by the acid inside the vinegar. So that explains what was happening to the eggshell, but why were the eggs getting bigger the longer they were left in the vinegar? Well, inside the eggshell there is a membrane, which is a thin sheet of tissue. This membrane is semi-permeable, and through a process called osmosis, vinegar and the water in the vinegar were able to pass through this membrane and go inside the egg. This made the egg swell up as they were taking in this liquid. This might also be why, although the day 2 and day 3 eggs felt sturdier to me, they broke easier than the day 1 egg. The longer they've been in the vinegar, the more liquid they've managed to take inside them, and that is actually going to stretch that membrane thinner. I think that is why the day 1 egg was the bounciest. So if you want a bouncy egg, leaving it for 1 day in white vinegar seems to give the best result. If you want a translucent egg, leaving it for 2 or 3 days was giving the best result, although it's easier to wash off the shell after 3 days. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay up to date with all future videos. As always, I would like to take this opportunity to answer any science questions you have about any science topics at all. So feel free to email me at stemwithmrn@outlook.com and I'll get back to you with answers to your questions. You can subscribe to the channel by pushing the button here, and I've added links here to the other STEM videos I've done so far, here to my STEM career interviews, and here to my robot review videos. This has been STEM with Mr. N, exploring bouncy eggs.